what's on the table is just, so how do we teach literature in a classical way? Again, when we talk about what we do and things that have worked well, and then we can talk about maybe, other problems or issues or whatever we want to do. Might sometimes talk about, what to read, picking out things to read for the different pages that we have, but I don't know how to begin, but let me just kick it over to
Shall we introduce ourselves?
Yeah, introduce.
Yeah, a little bit about my name is John Stroud. I'm an English department chair at a public high school in Washington, Illinois, next to the city of Concordia. Our congregation is trying to get a school started, which is why we ended up here. But I've been teaching rural literature to high school seniors from the original sources for quite a few years now, and using sort of what Dr. Ryan was talking about earlier, the argumentation, debate, question and answer type of format with those students.
Yeah, I think good teachers are classical whether they know it or not. I mean, all good teachers want their kids to know the material, understand it, be able to do something with it. You don't even have to know that that's the trivium, but I think wherever you find really good, in other words, this is classical, not because it's, well, this is how they used to do it. No, it's classical because it really is universal. And the kind of recognizing that again, a teacher don't have to do everything totally differently, but just sort of in an intentional way, get at these things that in many cases have already done.
My name is Bruce G. And to go from one extreme to the other, I have no education credentials whatsoever. I'm a homeschooling dad, and my wife and I have homeschooled for 13 years. I guess I do the literature part of it, or have in the past, and have any of you who didn't attend my workshop yesterday, what we talked about was reading out loud and the importance of children hearing literature read well, and that's really what brings substance to it, what brings it to life. And so that was kind of my shtick this week.
I'm Patty Hine. I teach at Shepherd and Springfield High School, so I'm doing session. And we do Western Civ, an integrated approach with literature, history, philosophy, and fine arts, done chronologically so they all make sense.
Okay, why don't you tell about how you teach literature? Because she was talking to me about this, and this is a great use of literature in a classical context.
Being classical, of course, we want to go ad fontes, so we want to get back to the sources. And most of our history books, but ancient Greece and Rome, were written so much later, with the exception maybe of Elizabeth passages. But the poetry is we do, and it gives us the Homer's run-through.
Yeah. Notice how it works. You can use literature to teach other things too. One thing about classical is you try to tie everything together. Notice when I erase my model, the narrative of showing something from the inside, reading sort of history, from 2,000 years distant, modern textbook trying to tell us what happened. Or you can read a work of literature from the time, and you're getting it from the inside. What the people there, what it felt like to be an ancient Greek or a Victorian, nobleman or whatever. And so, literature does become a really good way to get at a lot of other things. What else do you do?
What else do you do?
Okay.
Well, one of the things that you have to stress whenever you're going to start teaching literature from any age group is the idea that at the core of all good literature is an accurate picture of mankind and human nature. And it's not always a pretty picture, you know, it's mankind and human nature, whether it's influenced by God or whether he's rejected God and various works of literature. Human nature never changes in and of itself. It's only changed when God interacts with it in his own unique way. So we can start with the Iliad, the Odyssey, the anger of Achilles, who's mad because his king has stolen the woman that was given to him as spoils of war, and how his pride, his hubris, almost destroys his entire army before he comes to his senses, and then goes the other direction and plays the games of revenge against the Trojans and Hector. And then he started asking people to make connections between this kind of violent personality that is Achilles and some people that they interact with on a daily basis. Okay, how did his friends treat Achilles? What did they do right? What did they do wrong? Now, what does that tell us about how we have to handle people when we come face to face with folks who have the same kind of personality problems that Achilles had?
Those personality problems of this analysis.
This sense of recognition, reading something written thousands of years ago, and ooh, you see yourself. Shakespeare talks about literature as a mirror. Right. Yeah.
We can ask a question, right?
Yes, yeah, sure.
So, public school,
Right.
but you're not teaching classical literature classically in the public school. You're thinking about starting a school doing it in your
Yes,
church.
parochial school, probably, eventually K through 8.
Okay, and you're here just to find out if this is a good way to do it, right?
No, I know it's a good way to do it. What we want is objective proof that we can take back to the congregation and convince them that it's good.
Okay, and I understand that, and I think it's
I was,
wonderful too. My only concern as a principal is curriculum-wise and scope and sequence-wise, how do you build on, I mean, it's easy for a home school. They can take it if they got one person that teaches.
Right.
But I got 25 in the classroom, and I want to make sure that I'm doing this right. So what would you use for curriculum? And how would it build on one year to the next? And what curriculum are you using? Are you using the grade books, or are you using the junior grade books for grade school?
Yeah, well, this is from schools are already doing this. That was one of the things I really wanted to get into. Yeah.
In Casper, our history course goes chronological, starts with Greek and Romans, et cetera, Middle Ages, progresses each year is a different one, and we draw literature from those. Third and fourth grade class this past year did the Middle Ages. They read Beowulf, read King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table. They also read related literature like the Bible, which draws upon some of those things. And so that's one of the things that we did. We're basically following the Veritas Press recommendations. And the teachers, I forget exactly where they've gotten some of their material. They've also written a lot of the material that they use for study.
Just to follow up on that, the Veritas Press, when you check them out on the internet, it doesn't seem like it's scope and sequence. You can use some here, you can use some there. You've never found any problem with that. You just pick and choose what you want.
The teachers have used a lot of discretion as to what they use. And actually, that was one of the questions that I had put to the panel was, there's sort of a tension between, do you try to cover as much literature as possible, or do you really take your time with the literature?
That's really a good question, really good question. And how How would you respond to that?
Well, okay, what I would suggest, remember the trivia. I think one thing you need to think, you're going to be classical. What is the grammar of literature? What is the logic of literature? How do you understand literature? And what's the rhetoric of literature? And I think a lot of times, even in classical schools, you get into a model, you find a curriculum, and whether it's historically organized or whatever, but you soon, forget, the classical part of it. I mean, anyone can follow something in chronological order. So, to get these other things, I want to come back to that to talk about different levels and different curriculum that are out there. But I'm curious about what is the grammar of literature? What is the logic? What the rhetoric? Yeah.
I would think some of the grammar and literature is what Kathy talked about in her Western Civ class, that as we're going through our study, we're on our first pass through the study of history, and you have to know the references that are in those books.
Okay.
You have to be able to understand the imagery. You have to know Greek and Roman mythology. You have to know some of the legends and the people, because those references are used over and over again in literature. And if you don't know what they're referring to, it's lost.
Yeah.
We read Children's Homer this year, which was good for me, because I didn't understand the Iliad when I read it in high school. And so I'd say that's a grammar. I'm guessing that I'd say that's a grammar of literature, to give them a base, a simpler, easy to understand plot, so that when they read it, the real
Kind of like
stuff
what the
later
Lambs did
on,
with Shakespeare.
so much easier to understand them. And that's what Veritas Press does, is they recommend a group of books to go along with it. Now, there's a ton of books in there you can get, but they recommend you get these books. And they usually have literature units within the curriculum. They had children's home or literature unit to go along with it, along with the curriculum.
If you see the catalog, I'm not sure how the website has it organized, but in their catalog, it's actually organized by grade. They'll show first grade and all of what they use for first grade. I don't know what the website's organized, and that's what I want.
Let's go back to that. What you mentioned that in the first speech that you gave. Excuse me, I'm new to this. But I want to make sure I understand it. You mentioned this, the trivium, as something you can teach on any grade level. But when I read the classical information that I've read, and I've read a ton of it, the interpretation that I get is that grammar is only taught on the first through fourth, and analytical is only taught on the fifth through sixth, and rhetoric is saved for the high school. Now, I disagree with that, because I think rhetoric is something Lutheran schools can do exceptionally well in teaching catechesis throughout your school, and then having those 8th graders, and for us it's 7th graders, and eventually Luther's large catechism would be the 8th grade. But what we want to do is make sure that the 8th graders are sharing their faith with the kindergarten and first grade. And this is the advantage that a school has, as I see it, in being able to do this, and persuading, sharing a prayer and being persuasive. Am I wrong in that, or?
Well, I mean, I am different from Doug Wilson in my understanding of classical education. I don't see the trivium just as a sometimes it seems to be very inflexible, kind of dogmatic, and where do you get from one to the other? I think the trivium is the model that illuminates everything that we do. Maybe at the younger levels, grammar is mostly what you're doing, but I encourage teachers where you can, and actually when I see what Malcolm does and the other, they're doing some of the they're not just regurgitating things. They come to the level of understanding that they can. That's the logic. And then they do something with it. I study art. They're also doing drawings. That's rhetoric of art, you could say. And I think that's a very important thing. I think sometimes classical education, the things we do, our maintenance questions are doing. There's a curriculum that there's the kind of activist thing, obviously, where children are kind of making their own. The class is really a union, all of us. And I think that's the great genius of class. It is. So now again, there are different ways of being classical. It's not just one thing. And so that's why I think it's helpful to get a sort of big picture. And then when you're looking at curriculum, you can evaluate it. And you can adapt it if you need to.
Another thing is that we sometimes, you're talking about, well, the grammar stage is when children are best able to memorize, for example. The logic stage is when they really have developed, their brain is developed to the point where logic begins to come into play. Typically when you see a child starting to rebel against his father, bingo, we're in the logic stage. And the rhetoric is sort of the full flowering of this education in expression, but also each subject has a grammar, a logic, and a rhetoric stage. And just to give you an anecdote, my wife was asked to tutor a young man who had taken algebra in high school, but he had not done well, and so his parents hired my wife to do this tutoring. And one of the things she discovered was that he had never mastered the grammar stage of working with fractions enough that and the high school just rushed into it. No, you got this B in this, bingo, you're relevant. He never had mastery of the grammar stage of arithmetic to the point where he could take that logic and use it. So she just kicked him right back at the age of 16 back to the grammar stage and forced to master that. Then he moved up to the next stage, fine, and algebra was easy once he got one. So you have to understand also in terms of the trivium that we're talking about. Age groups in general, we're also talking about every subject matter has a trivium which is applied to it. Every single subject has a grammar level.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we were looking into classical education, when we began classical education, I'm sure I read a lot of the things that you did, talked about the ages and stages, and that was one thing that we were uncomfortable with, because I had my 7 or 8 year old say, Mom, that's just like.
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, well, I'm not going to say, sorry, we don't do that till 6th grade. And so when we came last year was the first time having this conference, and to hear Dr. B talk about that he didn't agree with that it's, that there is some logic and rhetoric going on with the younger grades, but it's predominant that they're in grammar. That when they're in the logic stage, they may still be learning grammar if you introduce them to subjects. They may have to go through a grammar stage for that, but predominantly they're in the logic phase. So, I really, there's that hard and fast K through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12. Not going to push it through child.
There's kind of one lesson that you're, in the illustration here, leads into one that I've learned in the last 3 years. I've been working with the Illinois State Board of Education on a project where we set up performance descriptors for students from kindergarten through high school in a sequence in 10 stages. And each stage is preparation for the stage that follows. So when you get into grammar and rhetoric and so on, we're asking 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers to start thinking about doing some rhetoric in the field of research and reporting back from 4th and 5th grade the results of the students' individual research. And the teachers are out there going, but do this in 5th grade. And we're saying, but you should be doing this in 5th grade if they're going to be proficient at this by the time you get to junior high or high school. So I subscribe to the idea that you got to have all 3 of the
That would be the rhetoric stage. In other words, grammar is you learn some things about literature. Second, the logic is that where you're talking about literature so that they understand it. So they understand the conflict. But they even reflect on the vicarious experience and learn maybe to evaluate literature. Then the rhetoric stage is when they do something with it. They write a paper about it, or write their own story, write their own poem. Again, you need to get at all of that whole range.
And even in kindergarten, they can write the story in pictures. and then stand there and narrate the story to their friends.
A narrating story, watching for a scene, and making a report is journal. That's not rhetorical.
Well,
That's expository. It's
It
explaining.
can be if they take it and
Maybe
do
not
an
have to do
application.
yeah, but in the sense that the way I'm defining it, it's on the grammar level, but they are writing, or they're starting with a blank piece of paper, or they're writing whether it's a report or whatever. That's teaching them, I think, to get ready to do the sort of things that then they'll do when the full-fledged time comes.
What we're suggesting is you can set them up to be for success as you progress from level to level and continue to push them to do some more complex things as they age. But if you don't set up the foundations early on for expanding your teaching into all of these different aspects of the truth, you can be preparatory for stages to allow you to be better and have them so that it becomes a natural extension of what
Yes.
I think one of the things we need to remember is that was touched on briefly, and that is what Dorothy Sayers points out in her essay, and that is after you've gone through a classical education and learned certain fields using this thing, you can then, as a college student or as a person starting in your own profession or creating your own line of work, use those tools to learn and create an academic discipline that you've never touched on before, like, say, economics. And when I started college, my father, who was a professor, said the first thing you have to do is learn the vocabulary of the discipline, and then learn to think in the vocabulary of the discipline. And then you can then begin to function.
Okay, that's the trivia. Let me throw out another topic, and think about content, how to handle content. Again, what do you read? Okay, now, the different ways you can use a curriculum. I mean, one, you can look at texts that are historically important if you're using literature as a kind of integrated way to go to learn history and other things. And yet, when you're teaching reading, not always, that's not the only way to approach literature, to teach, I mean, how would you teach this stuff? Teach noticing the conflict, what is the turning point? In other words, are you doing it, history is one way, it was one use of literature. Understanding literature in itself, and how to be a good reader, how to approach a text, how to use the imagination, how to attack a poem. That's what you're doing to it, attacking it. Where does that fit in? Is that something that you do, or?
Yeah, so Kathy asked out a reading list, and one of the texts that she had on her list was how to read a piece that C.S. Lewis had written. Does he talk about some of these subjects that Professor Beef was just mentioning?
He talks about reading up for the different ways to read. He takes the different ways of reading. He doesn't necessarily focus on the
It
grammar.
does emphasize vicarious experience by talking about the different experiences that get from that.
Would this be considered the grammar of literature?
I think so, because it's the vocabulary and the grammar and the syntax and how literature works.
I mean, at some point, I think you just teach this. You have a class where you
Illustrate
just
that work of
this,
literature.
and then you practice it. You read a book and you discuss. Okay, so what is it?
I, for one, had no idea Twinkle Twinkle Little Star was such great poetry.
Well, notice, I think you can sometimes, again, just as methods of doing it, start with something very simple. Now, if you're doing chronologically, to have, I don't know when you do it, you have a 6-year-old reading, the Iliad, and that's where you're, I think it may be a little much for them. Starting simpler, and then moving towards the complex, toward the more complex, starting with Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and the fairy tales. I heard from my mouth, several things. You got this, what is appropriate for the different levels, not just, as some say, well, does this have bad elements we don't exclude? No, what can they handle at a particular time? And then, moving them towards more complex things as they develop in their understanding.
But Professor, you can do this with Mequon and Seashell. You can start talking about the plot. What was their problem? There's all of that plot character setting. It's all there. You don't have to necessarily use those words in the grammar stage to introduce those concepts.
But at the same time, you're talking about problem-solving skills there that people might look and exhibit it.
We've got some stereotypical characters moving in the slides.
In fact, you could use, I don't want to say bad, but you can use sometimes the bad to teach the good. Because after a while, my daughter got way into music, and they have a great children's orchestra here, and so she was in that. And, she never was interested in the heavy metal stuff her friends were, because they were saying, she'd say, that just has 3 chords. She was studying Beethoven and Mozart, loving Mozart, and then if you learn, but you have to learn how to do it. I think sometimes we just throw things on students that they cannot handle, and so they reject it. Whereas if we were a little more careful, we could find good things that they could handle and move them to. For example, again, I'm a college professor. It's frustrating how so many of our students were turned off of literature because they had to read Silas Marner, which you shouldn't inflict George Eliot on an innocent or high school student. That's cruel and unusual. If you want to teach Victorian literature, Dickens, a good rollicking Dickens tale, they'll both like it and learn from it. George Eliot, she was moralistic without being moral. She was an atheist, but she felt that you should be very morally Victorian. We didn't need religion to do that. But it's not what she's saying, but it's just the insufferable seriousness that she portrayed there. Now, when you are studying Victorian literature, work on your master's degree in English, then you do need to read George Eliot. She's very important. But it seems like there are choices. There's so much good literature that you can be very selective. And I recommend keeping it to a level that the students are still finding it enjoyable.
And you have to, at the same time that you're picking literature, you have to find something that they can interpret and understand easily at their level of development. If you try to give them into something that, like George Eliot, goes beyond their current capabilities, and you turn them off to it the first time, you may be able to get them back. If you turn them off to something else a second or a third time, every time you turn them off, you're going to find it much more difficult to get to repair the damage. And you're going to end up being ultimately the judges of what's appropriate for your individuals. You know who your children are, who your students are, you know their strengths, their weaknesses, their likes, their dislikes, So when it comes down to picking the literature, you're gonna have to weigh all of these different factors when you decide what you want to take them into. It's not easy.
I think it's Mr. G in the middle. Could you integrate that with what you were saying yesterday? I was kind of struck when you had the challenge of a 20-year-old and a 6-year-old, I think, and, reading these pretty deep novels.
Well, I think the example I gave was reading aloud Anna Karenina to basically my 13-year-old and having my 6 or 7-year-old listen in while he was playing quietly, and being somewhat surprised that he really was tracking at least the details of the story, to the point where he could distinguish, he could make connections between these long patronymics and say, oh, he's him, and so on. And it surprises. I think there's a value, and I guess I'm talking here on the level of reading aloud. There's a value, there's an accessibility in reading literature aloud that you don't necessarily have when you have it there. It can be very rich and powerful. And so even in a classroom setting, I'm really a big advocate for
from every age, for readers of every age. And what she does is to take, the tried and true, the different genres, different types of literature from different historical periods too, but she sorted out, what works best for different age groups, different levels. So I've seen a few books like this, and that would be something to consult.
What was the author's name again?
Oh, Catherine Linsky. Write it down. Catherine Linsky. How to Grow a Young Reader.
yeah. Books Children Love, Honey for a Child's Heart is a couple of other great ones. Books Children Love, and Honey for a Child's Heart.
Yeah, very good. Let's see about who's behind you there for.
C.S. Lewis, I like his comment that any book that is worth reading only in childhood is not even worth reading then.
That's right. Yeah, and that's one of the great things is coming to these again as adults. And you really
Yes.
appreciate it more.
It's astonishing to read what was written to children, read to children, or what children read 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and see what the vocabulary was like, what the complexity of the sentences were like, and you think, well, what have we lost?
Dr. Pine brought that up in his talk. He talked about life and death and how to secure the future, and I didn't realize this. They don't talk about that.
And I was wondering if I've heard a couple of comments, and I hear from other friends and stuff, of, certain books, those themes are too mature, they're too adult. You got the comments in your session about Oedipus.
The Wife
You did
of
that
Bath.
with 9th graders, and is it because we've been so careful to clean up children's literature that we're uncomfortable with that, and yet people don't have any problem saying that kids from Harvard movie, but
The Old Testament.
Yeah, what do you say, Bob?
Or
Oh,
the
sorry.
children's fairy tales.
I was just going to say that, maybe these universal themes of life, that's really not too much for a kid's
Often children are really worried about these things. They think about, they worry about being abandoned. And so the fairy tales about Hansel and Gretel, about the children, that don't have their parent, and, they're lost. And that's very affirming, because it's like, you understand me. And then to show how these children triumph. They're victorious, even when the worst of all things happen, is really very, very comforting.
Theology in Sunday school too, we dumb it down.
Oh, terrible.
We don't tell them that they're little sinners and they're going to hell. So of course, then they become.
I guess I wanted to just remark, it's interesting to listen to this, because one of the things I'm very intent on is trying to help my kids to have a certain amount of scripture memorized at each phase. And one goal I have for my kids is that they're going to have pretty much the book of Proverbs memorized by the time they leave my home. Well, I'm trying to arrange those proverbs in sort of themes that I'm going to introduce them. And it's interesting that as you touch on some of the themes of literature, how some of the lessons from Proverbs come out. And I think, again, you know, it is appropriate, I think, to have the subject of adultery introduced to kids in 9th grade, because I want to teach my kids about being faithful to their spouse before they ever meet that person. That's something that starts in as soon as they reach puberty, that idea of faithfulness. I did have a question, though, John Stroud, since you are organizing this stuff in a more structured environment for public school, what are some of the books that you introduce in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades? And what are some of the books that you, if you were to name 3 to 5 books you really wish your kids had come into your class already having been introduced to, what would they be?
Well, first off, I'm kind of a subversive teacher for the public schools. I have a Lutheran teacher certificate from Concordia, Seward. And for years, I've taught Christian values and discussed literature in a secular classroom from a Christian point of view without labeling it as such, and I've gotten away with it. It's created some real interesting situations over time. But the pieces that I wish students were familiar with would be things like some of the Narnia tales. Particularly if they've been presented with parents sitting down reading them with the kids and laying out their own belief structure and the way, you know, C.S. Lewis didn't have everything right. He's looking at his allegory of religion and Aslan the Lion from his particular mindset and his particular training, which doesn't necessarily correspond with the mindsets and trainings of families. If we could get parents much more firmly involved in what their kids are reading and discussing with them what it means and what kinds of Christian value structure can be derived from these things. Christian values have to be one of the first keys to picking any kind of literature at any age level and presenting the world that we are in here, but not of, realistically.
Our time is out. We're going to hear next, I think, from Jim Talman here on rendering, the place that ties in really well with the creating literature as well as lots of other things. So he has a lot to add to this. I want to give him plenty of time and give us time to take a break. And
I have a good little definition for grammar.
Okay.
A pithy little definition.
Okay.
A grammar is a systematic treatment of the constituent parts of a body of knowledge.
Good. Good.
Listen.